Welcome to Business Insight. I'm Peter Marks. My guest is James Hoops. He's a distinguished professor of history at Babson College. His latest book is Corporate Dreams: Big Business in American Democracy from the Great Depression to the Great Recession. And we're going to be talking about a number of the interesting issues that he raises in this book. So, James, it's a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you for having me, Peter.
Why don't we start off just kind of give us a history of the corporation in America and how it inspired the American dream.
Well, the corporation is absolutely central to the American dream. The corporation created mass production, and the 1950s American dream, when the dream was at its height, was absolutely a corporate dream. It was based on the idea that the masses could earn middle-class incomes, but what made that possible was the organization of industry by the corporation. So the corporation was central to the American dream.
On the other hand, you talk about it as an undemocratic institution. What do you mean by that?
Well, the corporation was a sort of historical accident in America. The founding fathers had an idea that the country was going to be organized along agrarian lines and everybody was going to work for themselves, and that was going to be the basis of freedom. And then technological developments came along and pretty quickly made it more sensible economically to organize the country in a way that most people ended up working for someone else, and that someone else was the corporation.
Let's take a look back at some of the important landmarks, you could say, in history and the corporation. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, his second New Deal. What was kind of the impact of that?
Well, the second New Deal followed on the failure of the first New Deal, which was very carefully planned and thought out and absolutely went wrong. And so the second New Deal, Roosevelt and his administration didn't really quite know what they were doing, except they had to do something. And the Congress passed a very important bill called the National Labor Relations Act, the Wagner Act, which probably more than anything else made possible the 1950s American dream. And what it did was to create a legal framework for the mass production unions to give sort of countervailing power to labor against the corporations, set up a tension then that is in some ways still with us today, but also made it possible for wages to go up and for people to enjoy middle-class incomes from the 1940s to the 1970s.
Now, this was during the Depression, right? What do you think, what ended the Depression?
Well, there's really not much doubt that the Second World War was the key thing that ended the Depression, because it brought an enormous surge of government spending for the war, and the spending was handled in the money was raised in a very wise way, which was essentially we paid for the war, a lot of the war at the time, through taxes and through savings in the form of government bonds. And that made those savings then made possible after the war the consumption that made corporations prosperous and made high wages prosperous. But it is debated, of course, how successful the Second New Deal was in the 30s at ending the Depression. But I think it's probably a mixed story. The Depression was probably on its way to slowly being fixed when the war came along and fixed it very quickly.
Now, how does that differ from our experience with Iraq and Afghanistan, which people say is one of the causes of our current problems?
Well, of course, that experience unfortunately followed historical precedent. Most of the wars that we've fought on borrowed money rather than on savings. And so that's very typical of American history, a democracy.
By borrowed money, you mean getting it from China as opposed to our own people?
Well, either yes, or even borrowing it from our own people. We've often done that. The Second World War was financed not only by borrowing money, but by cutting consumption. If you borrow money, but you let consumption go along the same way, you're not engaged in the savings that will fund the war. So it was the combination of borrowing and saving in the Second World War, whereas the Vietnam War, for instance, Johnson had his guns and butter idea that we could both, we didn't have to save and we could spend more for the war. So the Second World War was really quite unusual. Iraq followed the more standard procedure that democratic societies follow, because people want to be told the war is a good thing, but they don't want to pay for this good thing.
Going back to the Wagner Act, which you mentioned,
Yeah.
and the NLRB, can you kind of trace the history of corporations and their battles against the unions?
Yeah, so first of all, the corporations didn't want to believe that this law was legal, and they believed that the Supreme Court would overturn the law very quickly. They turned out to be wrong, but for a couple of years
And what did the law do?
what the law did was to say that if a union has more than 50% support, it represents all of the workers in the plant. And so it basically gave workers the same kind of unity that management has, so that it wouldn't, if there was a walkout or a strike, it would be all leaving at the, and so it created a sort of countervailing power. The corporations resisted it very strongly initially, and then as it began being enforced, they saw they had to deal with it. After the Second World War, then, the corporations were very successful in getting the Taft-Hartley law passed, which weakened the unions considerably. It stopped the unionization of foremen, which was something that seemed likely to happen, and would have made the unions even more strong. So it weakened the unions relatively and started them on a long, slow course of decline. So the story I tell in the book is one of really the success of the corporation in the political battles that have been fought in the last 50 or 60 years.
How about the auto industry? They have a lot to do with labor. What happened to the American auto industry?
So the auto industry was key. After the war, it was believed that the country was headed for another depression. Only the war had cured the depression. When the war was over, we'd have another depression. And the evidence of that was that we had already consumed all of the automobiles that could possibly be consumed. Our leading industry was simply a replacement industry. There was thought to be no growth in it. What they didn't see was the two-car family, suburbanization, all of these things. But fortunately, General Motors leader Alfred Sloan recognized these possibilities, invested heavily, and so the automobile industry really led the way. The battle between GM and the United Auto Workers was key in those developments, and the UAW succeeded in beating back a very important 1946 strike in which the unions tried to get what were considered management prerogatives, especially pricing power, which they thought they could handle better than management, and would use that pricing power to prevent another depression. They didn't get that, and as a result of that, we get the conflict over wages and prices that fueled inflation for the next 20 or 30 years.
But then, we had a big boom in autos.
Yes.
And then what caused the Japanese all of a sudden to surpass us?
Well, two things. One was our labor costs then did get quite expensive compared to labor costs overseas. And then secondly, our automobile industry got pretty lazy. They had the largest market in the world, and they had oligopolistic power, and there wasn't really a lot of attention paid to quality, and so the Japanese came into our market with a large quality advantage that let them, so the combination of labor costs and superior Japanese quality was the story there.
You mentioned John Kenneth Galbraith,
Yes.
who, I don't know if cars are what he was talking about, but he talks about jobs, profits, and waste. What's kind of the connection? What was he getting at there?
Yeah, Galbraith believed that what was called the wage price spiral during that period was not correctly named. He thought the wage price spiral suggested that wages alone were the cause of inflation, and so he talked about the wage profit price spiral, and he wanted to make the point that corporate profits also drove up prices. He wanted to insist that inflation was something that happened not just when workers asked for higher wages, but when businesses charged higher prices. And so that was what that was about. But in general, that was a losing battle. The battle for moral authority, I argue in the book, was won by the corporations. And I don't think that's an entirely good thing. I think that...
One more question about Galbraith, and I do want to get to
okay.
He also talked about waste, what was his point, along with jobs and profits. The waste in terms of what people were buying. How did that...
Oh, I thank you very much. Yeah, so he had this idea of the affluent society that was built on the investment and marketing in what he thought of as useless products. Tail fins on automobiles, underarm deodorant, shaving cream with in which huge research investment was based. He thought all of that should go to investment in universities, into science, into pure research, and that this would create a more elevated American dream in which people would not just make very good incomes, but they would be doing work that he thought was nobler and better work. This was based on a belief that the corporate economy would kind of run itself, and you could just demand the things that you wanted it to do. That, of course, turned out not to be true.
One of the concepts an awful lot of people take for granted is that shareholder value, increasing shareholder value, is the primary role of the corporation, the corporate management. But you don't agree with that. Can you kind of explain what you see as a problem with that?
Well, the story I tell is of the corporation from what I call public purpose to private profit. For the first 500 years of the existence of corporations in Europe, the corporate form was used to support basically public purpose, universities, charities, religious institutions, roads, canals, things of that sort. And then it was really only in the 1700s, roughly 400 years ago, that the corporation began to be used by businesses. And as that happened, there was a slow shift. It took over 100 years, but gradually the mentality changed, and the corporation was an instrument of private purpose. And so the corporations do, of course, serve us. They serve our national interest in the sense that when they make themselves wealthy, they make the country wealthy. But there has been a loss, I think, in the sense of public purpose. Some of that is being recovered these days with the notion of social entrepreneurship, corporate social responsibility. But I think we need quite a bit more change of mentality in that direction.
Another concept that there's a lot of talk about is values-based leadership.
Yes.
Which tell us a little about your view on that.
Well, I'm very critical of that. And this is an example where I think the corporation and corporate culture pose a sort of subtle, unrecognized threat to democratic values and democratic culture. The democratic idea is that power is always suspect and that we should be wary and suspicious of our political leaders. And of course we are, appropriately so, I believe. In the corporate world, on the other hand, there's a tendency to claim the mantle of moral leadership and to say, to sort of think about, well, if leadership involves values and I have a leadership position, I must be a person of real integrity and a pretty good person, and can lead to a kind of hubris that is really an instrument of corruption. So if you look at the corporate scandals, you'll find, in Ken Lay of Exxon or in Ken Lewis of Bank of America, you'll find a lot of this talk about values-based leadership. And I think it's absolutely sincere, but there's not a real recognition of how dangerous these ideas are and how they can sort of corrupt you. They're seeping into the political system, and we hear more and more of that in the political system. And I think that's dangerous. I think we should hang on to our democratic idea that you watch leaders carefully, and the last thing you want leaders doing is just be going around talking about how they're leading the country or the company morally. You want them to be aware of the danger of corruption just as much as you are.